The air conditioning in the 40th floor boardroom always smelled faintly of burnt ozone and high-grade linen paper. Today it just smelled like fear. Richard Sterling's hands were shaking so violently that the single sheet of notarized document rattled against the podium microphone. Clack, clack, clack. A dry rhythmic panic. I watched the sweat break through his makeup, carving tiny gray rivers down his jowls. He looked at me across the glass table, his eyes wide, vacant, searching for a loophole that simply didn't exist. Then his knees gave out. The family's chief legal counsel, a man who had billed my father $800 an hour to dismantle my life, hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. Beside him, Cassandra started screaming. It was a shrill, ugly sound that shattered the sterile silence of Vance Global headquarters. Two federal agents in dark navy windbreakers stepped forward, their movements practiced, completely devoid of emotion. The sharp, metallic click-click of Smith & Wesson handcuffs closing around Tyler's manicured wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. "Vivian, you bitch," Tyler roared, spitting as he lunged toward me, restrained only by the heavy grip of a federal marshal. "You did this. You set us up." I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just sat perfectly still, slowly smoothing the fabric of my black Chanel dress. My father always told me that true power never needs to raise its voice. For months, the American tabloids had been feeding on our family drama like vultures. The public loves revenge stories, especially when they involve a multi-billion-dollar empire torn apart by greedy heirs. But people only see the theater. They don't see the math. They don't see the meticulous, cold-blooded architecture of a trap designed to let the targets hang themselves with their own avarice. 6 months ago, they thought they had broken me. They stood right where those federal agents are standing now, smirking, holding a stack of forged forensic accounting sheets. They handed me a brutal choice. Sign over my life's work and walk away penniless, or spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for a corporate fraud they invented. They thought I was weak because I didn't shed a single tear. They thought my silence was surrender. They snatched the pens, signing their own names to the takeover documents, laughing as they ordered security to escort me out into the Manhattan rain. But they forgot who actually built the foundation of this company. They forgot that I knew every hidden liability, every blind spot, and every regulatory trigger in our global network. They wanted the crown. So I gave it to them. Let me take you back to the room where it happened. Let me tell you exactly how I handed them the keys to a billion-dollar kingdom that was already rigged to burn. 10 years is a long time to live on black coffee, generic antacids, and 4 hours of broken sleep a night. But that was the price of admission. When my mother died, Vance Global wasn't a multi-billion-dollar titan. It was a bloated, mid-tier freight forwarding company with outdated software and a balance sheet that bled red ink every time fuel prices spiked. My father, Arthur Vance, had the vision, but he lacked the stomach for the digital age. I didn't. I was 22 when I took an office in the basement of our Newark warehouse, right next to the boiler room. The air was thick with the smell of damp pallets, diesel exhaust, and salt water from the bay. For 5 years, I didn't have a personal life. I didn't go to New York Fashion Week. I didn't summer in Nantucket. I built our proprietary algorithmic routing system from scratch. I coded the automated customs clearance APIs that cut our transit bottlenecks by 40%. By the time I was 30, I had moved from the basement to the corner office on the 40th floor. I had expanded Vance Global into a logistics and financial technology behemoth valued at $1.5 billion. I knew every union rep at the Port of Los Angeles by their first name. I knew which European maritime banks were liquid and which ones were leveraged to their teeth. The company wasn't just my career. It was my skin. It was my marrow. And while I was breathing life into that empire, the parasites were feeding on it. Cassandra entered our lives 6 years ago. She was my father's third wife, a woman whose beauty was as synthetic as her empathy. She possessed a terrifying low-frequency cunning that my father, aging and increasingly frail, never stood a chance against. With her came Tyler, her 24-year-old son from a previous marriage she preferred not to discuss. Tyler was a walking cliché of Manhattan privilege, Tom Ford suits paid for by company credit, a perpetual scent of expensive cologne and premium vodka, and a total lack of intellectual curiosity. To them, I wasn't the architect of their luxury. I was the help. I was the quiet, plain-faced workhorse who kept the cash flowing so they could charter Gulfstreams to Aspen and buy off-market brownstones in the West Village. "Vivian, darling," Cassandra would say, her voice dripping with artificial honey during her rare visits to the office. "You look so tired. You really should let Tyler handle the European accounts. A young woman shouldn't spend her best years looking at spreadsheets." What she meant was, "Get out of the way so my son can put his name on your achievements." Tyler didn't know the difference between a bill of lading and a leveraged lease. He would slide into my boardroom meetings an hour late, eyes bloodshot from the night before, and question my margins in front of the senior vice presidents. He wanted the prestige of the title without the calluses on his hands. When I refused to approve his $500,000 expense report for a networking safari in South Africa, he didn't argue. He just smiled. It was a wet, arrogant expression that told me he was playing a different game. A game where the rules were written in my father's bedroom. Then came the night of October 14th. I was at the terminal in Rotterdam, negotiating a union dispute that threatened to freeze our entire North Atlantic shipping lane. The rain was drumming against the corrugated steel roof of the Port Authority building when my phone buzzed. It wasn't Cassandra. It wasn't Tyler. It was my father's personal driver, a man who had been loyal to our family for 20 years. His voice was cracked with emotion. My father had suffered a massive ischemic stroke. He was at New York Presbyterian. I caught the first flight out of Schiphol. I didn't sleep for the 8-hour crossing. I stared at the flight tracker, watching the little digital plane crawl across a void of blue, my chest tightening until I could barely draw breath. When my cab finally pulled up to the hospital in Washington Heights, it was dawn. The New York air was crisp, smelling of wet asphalt and roasted coffee from a street cart. I ran through the sliding glass doors of the ICU, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to be stopped by 2 burly private security guards stationed outside room 412. "I'm Vivian Vance," I said, my voice shaking as I reached for my ID. "That's my father." The older guard looked down, his face a mask of professional indifference. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vance. We have strict orders. No visitors allowed without the express permission of Mrs. Cassandra Vance. She's his wife, I'm his daughter." I barked, a cold wave of panic rising in my throat. "Let me through." The door to the room opened, and Cassandra stepped out. She didn't look like a grieving wife. Her hair was perfectly blown out, and her black silk blouse didn't have a single crease. Behind her stood Tyler, leaning against the wall, twirling a gold Cartier pin between his fingers. "Vivian," Cassandra whispered, her voice loud enough for the nurses to hear. "Please don't make a scene. The doctors say any emotional stress could kill him. Your presence, it's too disruptive. Your father needs peace." "You're locking me out of my own father's room?" I whispered, the sheer naked malice of the move striking me like a physical blow. "We are doing what is legally permitted under his current medical proxy," Tyler said, stepping forward. He tapped the gold pen against his palm. Asterisk click. Click. Asterisk, go back to your ships, Vivian. We've got it from here. 3 days later, Arthur Vance died. I never got to hold his hand. I never got to say goodbye. But the true depths of their depravity didn't hit me until 5 days after the funeral. I returned to our family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, to collect my mother's old journals, the only things of value left in that house for me. As my car pulled up the long gravel driveway, I heard the bass, a heavy rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the leaded glass windows of the mansion. The driveway was packed with Lamborghinis, Porsches, and Range Rovers. They were throwing a party, a celebration of life. Cassandra called it on the embossed invitation she had sent to Manhattan's elite, but it was an execution of joy. Waiters in white tuxedos passed silver trays of caviar and vintage Dom Perignon. Guests laughed by the heated infinity pool. I walked through the French doors into the grand library, my boots clicking loudly on the herringbone hardwood. Cassandra was standing near the fireplace, holding a champagne flute, surrounded by a court of faux wall investors. And there, leaning against the marble hearth, was Tyler. He had taken down the oil portrait of my biological mother, the woman who had starved herself to help my father buy his first 3 trucks, and replaced it with a neon pop art print of a dollar sign. My mother's portrait was propped against the baseboard, next to an overflowing trash can. Someone had set a sweating cocktail glass directly on her painted canvas face, leaving a gray water-stained ring on her cheek. Tyler looked up, saw me staring at the painting, and took a slow sip of his champagne. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't even move the glass. "It's a new era, sis," he said, loud enough for the investors to hear. "Out with the old baggage." That was the exact moment the grief died inside me. In its place, a cold, crystalline stillness settled into my veins. I didn't yell. I didn't smash the champagne against his teeth. I looked at the water stain on my mother's face. And then I looked at Tyler's greedy, vacant eyes. "You want the empire," I thought, my mind spinning through the corporate ledgers, calculating the exact weight of the trap I was about to build. Asterisk, I am going to give you exactly what you asked for. And I am going to make sure it costs you your soul. Asterisk. The boardroom of Vance Global on Tuesday morning was 72 degrees, but it felt like an icebox. Outside, a miserable November sleet was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass, blurring the Manhattan skyline into streaks of gray slate. Inside, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of 200-pound cotton bond paper. I took my seat at the far end of the 30-foot Macassar ebony conference table. I didn't pour myself water. I didn't open my laptop. I just sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the execution squad assemble. To my left sat the board of directors. 7 men in bespoke charcoal suits, captains of industry who had smiled at my wedding, toasted my promotions, and cashed the dividend checks my algorithms generated. Today, not a single one of them would meet my eye. They stared at their tablets, fascinated by their own digital schedules, suddenly very busy, suddenly very spineless. At the head of the table sat Cassandra, flanked by Tyler and Richard Sterling. Sterling was the stereotype of an elite white-collar defense attorney. Silver hair combed back with military precision, an immaculate Brioni suit, and a gold signet ring on a hand that had never done an honest day's labor. He had a leather binder open in front of him, stacked 3 inches deep with documents. Tyler didn't look at the files. He was busy adjusting his platinum Audemars Piguet watch, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Vivian," Sterling began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that carried the weight of 30 years in the federal courts. "I suggest you leave your recorder off for this session. What we are about to discuss does not leave this room. For now." "Get to the point, Richard," I said. My voice was flat. No tremor. No anger. Just the cold tone I used when a shipping lane in the South China Sea was blocked. Sterling sighed, a theatrical display of paternal regret. He slid a thick cerulean blue binder across the polished wood. It stopped exactly 2 inches from my folded hands. On the cover, embossed in silver letters, were the words, Asterisk Forensic Financial Assessment, Vance Global Internal Accounts, Asterisk. Over the past 48 hours, an independent audit team has been reviewing the European Logistics Division's capital allocations, Sterling said, leaning forward. He tapped the binder with a manicured index finger. Specifically, the wire transfers routed through our Rotterdam clearinghouse between May and October of this year. We found a discrepancy. A massive one. Define discrepancy, I said. $54.2 million, Tyler chimed in, leaning over the table, his eyes bright with a vicious, unearned triumph. Systematically siphoned from our operational cash flow and routed through a shell entity registered in the Republic of Panama. An entity called Aegis Holdings Limited. Care to guess whose digital signature authorized every single one of those wires, sis? I didn't answer. I reached out, opened the binder and turned the pages. The documents were beautiful. They had real Vance Global letterheads. They had valid bank routing numbers from Deutsche Bank. And there, at the bottom of 24 separate wire confirmations, was my electronic signature, backed by my private corporate security key. There was even an audio file log appended to the back. A transcript of a phone call made to the chief financial officer in Rotterdam, confirming the urgency of the transfers. The voice print matched mine perfectly. The phrasing was mine. The cadence was mine. It was a masterpiece of corporate forgery. They must have spent $500,000 hiring a rogue cyber forensics firm to build the deepfake audio and manipulate the cryptographic keys on our legacy servers. This is embezzlement, Vivian, Cassandra said. She brought a delicate lace handkerchief to her eyes, though there wasn't a hint of moisture on her face. Grand larceny. Wire fraud. Violation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Your father is barely cold in his grave, and you were already packing your bags to flee to a non-extradition country. It breaks my heart. Your heart is a regulatory hazard, Cassandra, I said softly, not looking up from the forged bank statements. Tyler slammed his palm on the table. The water glasses rattled. Shut your mouth. You don't talk to my mother like that. You're done, Vivian. You think you run this town? You think you're the untouchable queen of logistics? You're a thief. A common, greedy thief who got caught with her hand in the vault. He stood up, walking down the length of the ebony table until he was standing directly behind my chair. The scent of his Creed cologne was suffocating, a sweet chemical stench that made my stomach turn. He reached over my shoulder, his fingers digging into the nylon strap of my corporate ID badge that hung around my neck. With a violent jerk, he snapped the breakaway clip. You don't belong here anymore, Tyler whispered, his breath hot against my ear. He threw the plastic badge onto the floor in front of me. Then, with deliberate, slow malice, he brought his black leather Oxford shoe down on top of it. He twisted his heel. The plastic casing shattered with a sharp crack, fracturing the digital photograph of my face into a dozen jagged lines. The board members remained motionless. One of them cleared his throat. Another shifted his weight in his leather chair. Nobody spoke. The silence of the room was absolute, a collective validation of the murder they were committing. Here is the reality of your situation, Vivian, Sterling said, his tone returning to that chilling, professional neutrality. He slid a second, much thinner document across the table. This one was a single-page contract. We have the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York on speed dial. We have a forensic team ready to hand over these servers to the FBI's white-collar crime unit by noon today. If that happens, you will be indicted before the market closes. You will lose your license, your assets will be frozen, and you will spend the next 15 to 25 years in a federal correctional facility. He paused, letting the word facility hang in the damp air of the room. However, Sterling continued, Cassandra is minded to be merciful. For the sake of the family name. If you sign this document immediately, you will voluntarily resign from all executive positions within Vance Global. You will surrender your 34% voting stock to the estate, and you will waive all claims to your father's residual property. In exchange, the company will decline to file a criminal complaint, and we will allow you to walk out of this building with your personal effects. You have 5 minutes. I looked down at the ruined piece of plastic beneath Tyler's shoe. Then I looked at the contract. My mind wasn't panicked, it was calculating. Jeffrey Archer once wrote that the greatest mistake a businessman can make is to believe his own balance sheet. But Sterling's mistake was worse. He had trusted his client's greed. I looked at the name of the shell company they had used to frame me. Aegis Holdings Limited. My fingers traced the edge of the paper. They didn't know. In their haste to fabricate an embezzlement scheme that would stick to me, they had searched our European registry for a dormant entity they could manipulate. They found Aegis. What Sterling's high-price firm hadn't realized, because they didn't have access to the off-ledger maritime archives I kept in my private safe, was that Aegis Holdings wasn't dormant. 3 months ago, before my father died, I had restructured Aegis to absorb the toxic operational debt of our failing Mediterranean short-sea container fleet. It was a corporate trash can, holding over $400 million in unhedged fuel derivative liabilities and international maritime liens. More importantly, under Delaware corporate law, Aegis was bound by a strict parental guarantee. If anyone took absolute control of the parent company without executing a full, independent financial audit within 30 days of succession, the entire debt of Aegis would automatically breach its corporate veil, transferring directly to the personal estates of the new controlling officers. They were so eager to strip my crown that they hadn't bothered to read the plumbing. I looked up. I let a small, fragile shadow of a tremor touch my lower lip. I let my shoulders sink just an inch, giving them the exact visual cue they were praying for. The image of a broken woman, a defeated daughter. And if I sign, I whispered, keeping my voice low, strained, it ends? No police? No press. You have my word as an officer of the court, Sterling said. his eyes softening with the contemptuous pity of a man who believed he had just won a war without firing a shot. "Sign the paper, Vivian," Cassandra urged, her voice smooth, deadly. "Let us clean up your mess. Go find a quiet life somewhere. You never really had the stomach for the big leagues anyway." I reached out my hand. My fingers were cold, but my grip on the heavy Montblanc pen was absolute. I pulled the document toward me. Click. The sound of the pen opening was loud in the dead space of the room. I looked at Tyler. He was still smirking, his foot resting on the fragments of my identity. "5 minutes are up, sis," he said. I lowered the nib to the parchment and signed my name. Vivian Vance. Clear. Sharp. No hesitation. I stood up, leaving the pen on top of the paper. I didn't look at Cassandra. I didn't look at the board. I looked straight at Tyler, and for the first time in 6 months, I let him see me smile. It was the smile of a ghost. "The company is yours, Tyler," I said softly, my voice cutting through the chill of the room like a razor. "I hope you enjoy every single dollar." I turned and walked out, my heels clicking a steady, unbroken rhythm against the marble floor of the corridor, leaving them alone with their prize. I stood up, leaving the pen rolling slowly across the macassar ebony until it hit the edge of the blue folder. Richard Sterling snatched the signed release form before the ink could even dry. He ran his thumb over my signature, checking the loop of the V against my corporate passport file. A professional habit. Trust but verify. Especially when you're executing a corporate assassination. Tyler leaned back in his leather chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and let out a short, wet laugh. "Smart girl," he muttered, kicking the pieces of my shattered ID badge under the table. "You always did know how to save your own skin when the numbers stopped adding up." Cassandra didn't speak. She just watched me with those gray predator eyes, her hand smoothing down the lapel of her tailored Chanel jacket. She looked pleased. The nuisance was handled. The maid's daughter had been put back in her place. "There's just one small detail," I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the HVAC vents. I picked up my coat, a gray cashmere trench, and slung it over my arm. "The addendum I requested. Section 9.4. I want it executed now." Sterling frowned, his silver eyebrows knitting together as he flipped to the back of the contract. He scanned the paragraph I had written out by hand in the lobby an hour before the meeting. I had told him it was a standard mutual release. A clean break to ensure they wouldn't change their minds and call the U.S. attorney anyway, once they realized how badly Tyler had messed up the third-quarter domestic freight margins. Section 9.4. Sterling read aloud, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, legal drone. "The corporation hereby accepts absolute, immediate, and unconditional operational control from the resigning executive. Furthermore, the incoming officers explicitly waive all future claims, operational indemnifications, and look-back rights against Vivian Vance, assuming full, retroactive responsibility for all subsidiaries, off-balance sheet structures, and active maritime entities linked to Vance Global." Sterling paused, looking up over his reading glasses. He was looking for the catch. A good lawyer always looks for the catch. But he was looking in the wrong direction. He thought I was trying to protect myself from the $54 million embezzlement charge they had just manufactured against me. He thought this clause was my shield. "You're trying to insulate yourself from Panama," he said. "You want to make sure we can't sue you civilly after you walk out." "I want a clean break, Richard," I replied, keeping my eyes neutral, my breath steady. "You want the company. I want my freedom. If you don't execute that absolute handover right now, I pull my signature, we call the FBI, and we can let a federal judge decide whose encryption key moved those funds." Tyler sat forward, slamming his hand on the armrest. "Just sign the damn addendum, Richard. She's terrified. Look at her. She wants to run before the feds show up. Let her." Pure, unadulterated human greed. It's the oldest blind spot in history. It completely shuts down the analytical centers of the brain. Sterling looked at Tyler, then at Cassandra. Cassandra nodded once, an impatient jerk of her chin. Sterling sighed, pulled his own gold cross pen from his pocket, and initialed Section 9.4. He stamped it with the corporate seal, the heavy iron lever making a sharp, final thud against the paper. "It's done," Sterling said, sliding my copy across the table. You are officially a stranger to Vance Global. I picked up the paper. The texture of the bond was crisp against my fingertips. I folded it neatly into thirds and slipped it into the interior pocket of my coat. They thought they had just granted me asylum. They had no idea they had just signed their own death warrants. What Richard Sterling didn't know, because he had spent the last 6 months auditing my personal accounts instead of checking our international maritime filings, was the exact structural layout of Aegis Holdings Limited. When Tyler's legal team hacked our European database to find an entity to pin their fake wire transfers on, they chose Aegis. Its status was listed as active/non-operational. To a standard corporate lawyer, that meant a shell company, a ghost in the machine, a safe place to dump fake transactions. But Aegis wasn't a ghost. It was a vault. Under Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 271, a parent company can insulate itself from the debts of its subsidiaries through what is called a corporate veil. But 3 months ago, while my father lay dying in that hospital room, I knew what Cassandra and Tyler were planning. I had seen the secret meetings with Sterling on the security logs. I knew the coup was coming. So I moved. I executed a private cross-corporate guarantee between Vance Global's core logistics line and Aegis Holdings. I transferred $412 million of unhedged fuel derivative debt from our failing Mediterranean container fleet directly into the Aegis ledger. Then I added a tiny radioactive piece of legal plumbing, a strict, non-severable parental survival clause. According to that clause, if Vance Global underwent an absolute operational handover without a full independent financial audit executed within 30 days of succession, the corporate veil between the parent company and the personal estates of the incoming controlling officers would instantly and permanently dissolve. By signing Section 9.4 just now, Tyler hadn't just taken over the company. He had legally married my debt. He had bypassed the 30-day safety window. The absolute handover was active now. The veil was pierced. Every luxury penthouse Cassandra owned, every offshore trust Tyler used to fund his gambling habits in Macau, every piece of real estate my father had left them, it was all legally chained to a $400 million maritime bomb. And I had just handed them the match. I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel, walked out of the boardroom, and left them to rot in their stolen glass castle. For the first 90 days, I did nothing but watch the ink dry on their mistakes. I rented a quiet, unadorned brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, far from the polished marble of Upper East Side penthouses. From my second-floor window, the East River looked like a strip of tarnished silver under the gray winter sky. I spent my mornings drinking cheap black coffee, listening to the creak of the floorboards, and monitoring the SEC's Edgar database on an encrypted laptop. I had deleted every digital trace of Vivian Vance. To the world, I was a defeated heiress who had crawled away to lick her wounds. To Cassandra and Tyler, I was a non-entity. They celebrated my departure with the loud, performative vulgarity unique to the suddenly rich. By February, Tyler's face was smeared across the cover of Crane's New York Business. The headline read, "The New Blueprint: How Tyler Vance Modernized a Logistics Giant." In the cover photo, he stood in my old office, hands on his hips, his Tom Ford suit straining slightly against a chest puffed out with unearned pride. The article was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. It credited Tyler with a 22% spike in Q1 net profitability. They didn't mention how he achieved it. I knew the math within 5 minutes of reading their preliminary earnings report. Tyler had slashed the compliance budget by 30%, laid off 40 veteran port managers in Long Beach and Newark, and delayed the mandatory maintenance cycles on our North Atlantic container fleet. It was the classic play of a corporate raider. Starve the muscle to make the fat look like growth. It looks beautiful on a 90-day chart. It's fatal on a 360-day horizon. The cash burn started almost immediately. Cassandra bought a $34 million Neo-Palladian estate in Southampton, putting $12 million down and financing the rest through a jumbo loan at Deutsche Bank. She used her newly acquired Vance Global stock as collateral. Tyler bought a custom matte black Gulfstream G650 and hired a personal security detail to follow him to clubs in the meatpacking district. Every weekend was a fresh invoice. Every invoice was paid out of the company's operational reserves. By April, the friction began. Without my algorithmic tuning, the proprietary routing software started to lag. Transit bottlenecks at the port of Rotterdam grew from 12 hours to 4 days. Demurrage fees, the penalties paid for letting cargo sit on the docks, began to accumulate at a rate of $85,000 a day. The core margins of Vance Global plummeted from a healthy 18% to a razor-thin 6%. They were bleeding liquidity, but their vanity wouldn't allow them to slow down. They needed a massive injection of capital to sustain the illusion of their success. They needed a public offering, an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. They thought the market was their savior. They didn't realize I was the one who built the altar. The push toward the NYSE wasn't Tyler's idea. It came from Christian Ward, a senior managing director at a boutique Wall Street advisory firm. Tyler met him at a private box during the Knicks game at Madison Square Garden. Christian was charming, expensive, and completely convincing. He dropped the bait over a plate of Wagyu ribeye. Vance Global is hot, Tyler. If you launch an IPO by July, Wall Street will value this company at $3 billion. You'll be a billionaire on paper before the summer ends. Tyler bit the hook so hard his teeth rattled. What Christian didn't tell him was that his firm's retainer fee was being paid through an offshore account in Belize, an account funded entirely by my private holdings. I had hand-selected Christian for his specific brand of Ivy League slickness. Tyler, who always craved validation from the blue blood establishment, never stood a chance. There's just one catch, Christian had casually remarked, leaning back and swirling his scotch. The underwriters at Goldman Sachs hate fragmented structures. You've got this offshore entity in the Caymans, Aegis Holdings Limited. It's sitting on your books like an orphaned limb. If you want a $3 billion valuation, execute a full structural merger. Absorb Aegis into the parent company before you file your Form S-1 with the SEC. It shows Wall Street total consolidated control. The next morning, Tyler stormed into Richard Sterling's office on Park Avenue. I know exactly how the conversation went because the burner phone Tyler used to call his mother that afternoon was being mirrored to a server in Reykjavik. We need to absorb Aegis, Tyler had barked. Christian says it adds 20% directly to our paper asset base. It's a no-brainer. Sterling, to his credit, hesitated. He understood that merging an offshore entity required a deep, forensic audit. Due diligence takes time, Tyler, Sterling warned, his voice crackling through the phone line. We need to verify every asset, every account, every historical liability inside Aegis. It will take at least 90 days to clear the logs. We don't have 90 days, Tyler shouted back, his voice rising to that familiar pitch of spoiled panic. The IPO window closes in June. Goldman wants the preliminary prospectus by Friday. Vivian signed a total release form, remember? Aegis is clean. It's just a shell she used to hide her pocket money. Greed makes even the smartest lawyer stupid. Sterling looked at the calendar, then at the potential $5 million bonus his firm would cash if the IPO went through. He chose to believe the lie he had helped create. He prepared the emergency merger resolutions without ordering a full transactional look-back. On May 12 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Tyler Vance sat at his desk, surrounded by television cameras from a business news network documenting his road to Wall Street. With a gold pen, he signed the absolute consolidation decree. He rolled Aegis Holdings Limited into the core foundation of Vance Global. The trap was officially sprung. The $412 million debt I had buried inside Aegis was no longer insulated by an offshore veil. By his own hand, Tyler had pulled the bomb out of the basement and wired it directly into his family's personal bank accounts. He smiled for the cameras, flashed his platinum watch, and shook Richard Sterling's hand. I watched the live broadcast from my quiet brownstone in Brooklyn. I leaned my head back against the brick wall, closed my eyes, and took my first deep breath in 6 months. Enjoy the spotlight, Tyler, I thought. The velvet curtain is about to come down. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a symphony of unmitigated arrogance on the night of June 5th. The sheer scale of the excess was calculated to intimidate. Over 700 guests, the absolute crust of Manhattan's financial elite, hedge fund managers and white-shoe lawyers, mingled beneath the 7-tiered crystal chandeliers. The air was a thick, suffocating blend of roasting white truffles, expensive French perfume, and the crisp, clean scent of brand-new currency. According to the internal accounts payable ledger I still monitored, the invoice for this single evening was exactly $412,560. It had been billed directly to Vance Global's corporate accounts receivable under the heading of IPO Marketing Outreach. Tyler had even flown in 20,000 white orchids from Colombia, just to decorate the grand staircase. The flowers were already wilting under the heat of the television lights. The ticker symbol $VNCG was set to go live on the New York Stock Exchange at 9:30 the following morning. The preliminary pricing had locked in at $28 a share, giving the consolidated company an implied market capitalization of $3.2 billion. On paper, Tyler Vance was about to become one of the youngest billionaires in America. I arrived at precisely 8:45. I didn't use the valet. I had my cab drop me off 2 blocks away on Fifth Avenue, walking the rest of the distance through the warm summer air. I wasn't wearing the plain wool coats or the sensible flats I used to wear when I lived in the Newark warehouses. For tonight I chose a backless gown of heavy midnight black silk crepe, tailored by a discreet atelier in Milan. It had no visible labels, no loud logos. It didn't need them. The fabric clung to my frame like liquid graphite, moving with a dangerous, quiet fluidity. Around my neck was a single flawless strand of black South Sea pearls that had belonged to my mother. It was the only piece of jewelry I owned. When I walked through the double doors of the ballroom, the room didn't stop, but the immediate circle of chatter around the entrance died a sudden death. Cassandra saw me first. She was standing near the ice sculpture of a container ship, holding a glass of Roederer Cristal. She looked spectacular in a silver Givenchy gown that cost more than a port manager's annual salary. Her diamond necklace was so large it looked heavy, but when her eyes met mine, her manicured hand froze midair. The diamond rings clicked against the crystal glass. "Who let the ghost in?" she whispered, her voice slicing through the laughter of the investors around her. Tyler turned around. His face was flushed from 3 rounds of premium scotch and the intoxicating high of his own upcoming wealth. He looked at me, his eyes running down my dress, his smirk returning slowly, like oil slicking over water. He stepped away from a group of analysts from Morgan Stanley and walked toward me, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the parquet floor. "Well, well," Tyler said, loud enough to draw the attention of the nearest tables. "Look who crawled out of the outer boroughs. What's the matter, Vivian? Did your rent check bounce in Brooklyn? Or did you just want to see what a $3 billion room looks like before we bar you from the building?" Richard Sterling stepped up beside him, a leather portfolio tucked neatly under his arm. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. "Vivian," he said, nodding once with the cold, professional courtesy of a hangman. "I didn't think you'd have the stomach for this. If you're here to make a scene regarding your severance package, I strongly advise against it. Security has explicit instructions." "I'm not here for a scene, Richard," I said. My voice was a low, steady hum that forced them to lean in to hear me. "I'm just a spectator. I wanted to see how my father's name looked on the big board." "Your father's name is history," Tyler laughed, taking a slow sip of his drink. "It's my name on the S1 filing. I consolidated the assets. I cut the dead weight. Tomorrow morning when that opening bell rings, I'm the one who owns the supply chain from Rotterdam to Seattle. You're just a footnote, sis. A broken line on an old chart." I didn't answer him. I didn't look hurt. I just reached out, took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter's tray, and raised it slightly toward Tyler. "To your consolidation," I murmured. "May it give you everything you deserve." At exactly 9:14 the music stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade-out. The 5-piece jazz band on the stage simply ceased playing mid-measure. The sudden absence of sound was louder than a gunshot. A confused murmur rippled through the 700 guests as people turned toward the grand entrance. The $20,000 white orchids on the staircase were pushed aside. 10 men and women walked into the grand ballroom. They weren't wearing tuxedos or evening gowns. They wore dark, sharp business suits, their movements synchronized, heavy, and completely devoid of theatricality. 3 of them carried black leather briefcase-style field kits. The men on the flanks wore navy blue nylon windbreakers over their button-downs. Printed across the back of those jackets in bold, reflective yellow block letters were 2 acronyms that made every Wall Street banker in the room instantly drop their glasses. DOJ and IRSCI. The federal government doesn't raid a charity gala at the plaza, unless they are looking to make an example. The lead investigator was a tall, angular man named Special Agent Marcus Vance. An ironic coincidence that always made me smile. He didn't use a megaphone. He didn't need to. He walked straight to the center of the ballroom, his leather soles thudding against the floor, and pulled a tri-folded parchment from his breast pocket. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Vance announced, his voice carrying the dry, unyielding authority of a federal warrant. "This event is officially concluded. Under the authority of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1956, and Chapter 11 of the Internal Revenue Code, the United States Department of Justice has issued an emergency asset seizure and freeze order on all core accounts, holdings, and entities associated with Vance Global Incorporated." The room erupted into a low, panicked roar. Bankers began frantically checking their encrypted tablets. Lawyers immediately huddled into small, defensive circles. Tyler's martini glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble base of the ice sculpture. The green olive rolled across the floor, stopping right against the toe of my black silk shoe. "What the hell is this?" Tyler screamed, his voice breaking as he lunged toward Agent Vance, only to be blocked instantly by the broad, solid chest of a federal marshal. "Do you know who I am? We are going public tomorrow. R1 is approved. This is a multi-billion-dollar corporation." Agent Vance didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Mr. Tyler Vance," he said calmly, pulling a pair of high-grade steel cuffs from his belt. "As of 2 hours ago, a grand jury in the Southern District of New York returned a 24-count criminal indictment against you, Cassandra Vance, and the corporate entity of Vance Global for systemic international wire fraud, tax evasion, and the willful laundering of $400 million in toxic maritime liabilities through a fraudulent merger with Aegis Holdings Limited." Tyler turned a horrific, chalky shade of gray. The sweat broke through his hairline, dripping down his forehead and ruining the collar of his Tom Ford shirt. He spun around, his eyes wild, frantic, grabbing Richard Sterling by the lapels of his Brioni suit. "Richard! Fix this!" Tyler shrieked, his hands shaking so violently he tore a button from the lawyer's jacket. "Tell them it's a mistake. We have the waiver. Vivian signed the waiver. She's the one who handled Europe. She did this. She set us up." Sterling didn't answer. For the first time in his long elite career, the silver-haired attorney looked completely, utterly terrified. His leather portfolio slipped from his grip, scattering confidential IPO documents across the floor, where they were instantly stamped by the wet boots of the federal agents. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I stood perfectly still in my midnight black dress, took a slow sip of my water, and watched the thonglong close around their necks. Richard Sterling pulled himself away from Tyler's frantic grip, his professional survival instinct overriding his panic. He smoothed his rumpled Brioni jacket, his hand trembling slightly as he reached into his leather case. He pulled out the official laminated copy of the settlement agreement I had signed 6 months ago. His face hardened, regaining a desperate sliver of his usual courtroom arrogance. "Agent Vance," Sterling said, his voice amplified by the podium microphone he had quickly stepped toward. Screech. The feedback cut through the ballroom's panicked murmurs. "You are acting on flawed intelligence. My clients are insulated from any legacy liabilities. 6 months ago, Vivian Vance signed a total, unconditional operational release. She took full responsibility for the European routing accounts. If there is fraud inside Aegis Holdings, it belongs entirely to her. My clients are protected by the corporate veil." Special Agent Marcus Vance didn't flinch. He slowly adjusted his gold-rimmed aviators, looking at Sterling with a clinical, detached pity. "I am familiar with the document, Mr. Sterling. In fact, Ms. Vance provided a certified copy to the Department of Justice 3 weeks ago. I suggest you turn to the addendum, Section 9.4. Read the specific rider you initialed and stamped with the corporate seal." Sterling frowned. The silver-haired lawyer adjusted his reading glasses, his fingers flipping frantically to the final page. He found my handwritten addendum paragraph. He began to read it aloud over the open microphone, his voice confident at first, aiming to humiliate me before the crowd of Wall Street elite. "Section 9.4, Sterling read, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "The corporation hereby accepts absolute, immediate and unconditional operational control and explicitly waives all future claims. He stopped. The cadence of his speech hitched. The color drained from his lips, leaving them a dull, bruised purple. "Keep reading, counselor," Agent Vance said coldly. Sterling swallowed hard, a visible jerky lump moving down his throat. The microphone caught his ragged, uneven breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was cracked, stripped of all its baritone authority. By enforcing the absolute and unconditional operational takeover, without executing the safety audit under Clause 9. Sterling whispered, his eyes wide, glassed over, darting across the lines as if looking at a firing squad. The incoming heirs voluntarily trigger the corporate veil piercing, legally binding 100% of their personal assets, offshore trusts and family estates to satisfy all structural liabilities and federal fraud penalties of the acquired entities, with immediate and non-dischargeable effect. The ballroom went dead silent. The elite financial analysts in the very front row understood the ruinous math instantly. A collective gasp rippled through the space. Sterling's hand shook so violently the paper tore. His legal mind, trained to dissect liability, realized the absolute horror of what he had signed. By rushing the merger of Aegis to launch the IPO without a forensic look-back, he hadn't just consolidated assets. He had bypassed the mandatory safety window. He had legally stripped his own clients of their limited liability protection. Worse, as the certifying attorney who approved the fraudulent SEC prospectus without verification, his own firm's escrow accounts and personal assets were chained to the blast radius. $412 million of toxic debt, combined with federal fraud penalties, was now a personal judgment against them. It was non-dischargeable. No bankruptcy loop could save them. Sterling looked up at me with hollow, bleeding eyes. His knees buckled completely. The legendary Park Avenue fixer hit the polished floor, dry heaving into the expensive, wilting white orchids he had bought. He was utterly, completely, and permanently broken down. Cassandra's glass of crystal shattered on the marble. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed in a heap of silver Givenchy silk, her diamonds hitting the floor with a hollow metallic ring. Nobody moved to help her. Tyler broke completely. The smug arrogance washed out of him, leaving a hollow, terrified boy. He dropped heavily to his knees, his hands reaching out to clutch desperately at the hem of my black silk gown. The television cameras swiveled instantly, capturing every single tear, every frantic sob, broadcasting his total public humiliation live to millions. "Vivian, please," he wept, his voice cracking under the weight of the handcuffs. "Save us. You know the code. You know how to fix the ledger. We'll give it back. All of it. Just tell them it was a corporate mistake." I looked down at his trembling, manicured hands, then calmly stepped back, letting him fall forward onto the bare floorboards. "I told you 6 months ago, Tyler," I said softly, my voice carrying over the dead ballroom. "The company is yours." 2 burly federal marshals hauled him up by his armpits, clicking the steel cuffs tight. As they dragged them out into the flashing lights of the waiting media vans, the ballroom emptied like a sinking ship. Over the next 30 days, the financial liquidation was absolute. Vance Global's stock crashed to zero before the opening bell could even ring on Wall Street. The Southampton estate, the custom Gulfstream, the offshore trusts, the government seized every asset to satisfy the massive liens. But a global logistics network cannot simply be abandoned. The ports required a licensed custodian. Because I had spent the last 6 months quietly shorting Vance Global stock through independent European trusts, I possessed the only clean liquidity left in the market. At the federal bankruptcy auction, burdened by liabilities no normal investor could unlock without my private cryptographic software keys, I bought back my father's core assets, the software patents, and the infrastructure. The final price? Exactly $1. They wanted the crown, but they forgot that the throne is just a chair. The real power was always inside the mind that built it. My father's name was finally clean. Justice isn't always fast, but when it arrives, the math is always flawless. If you believe that true justice finds its ledger, hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next, stay sharp.